In our last lecture module, we introduced divine command theory, the theory that identifies the source of an action's goodness or badness, the normative force of a particular moral code or rule in the will of some deity. I observed that this view, while it identifies the source as a deity, really is a view about morality having its source in authority, in the commandments of authoritative figures. We then went on to consider some of the features and implications of divine command theory that might make it attractive to philosophers of religion or theologians or just ordinary people. Some of the things that might motivate people to adopt it as a view about the source of an action's goodness or badness, its praiseworthiness or its blameworthiness, and indeed the source of the normative force of our moral reasoning and moral codes. In this lecture module, we pivot from discussing the potential advantages that might motivate one to adopt divine command theory to contemplating the potential difficulties faced by advocates of that view. We'll begin our discussion by considering the Euthyphro dilemma. And scholars attribute this first and probably primary objection to divine command theory to the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. And Plato presents a version of an argument to establish this dilemma in his dialogue, the Euthyphro. Plato wrote the Euthyphro around 380 BCE, before the Common Era. So, despite the fact that we've been talking about divine command theory largely within the context of contemporary religious theology, Plato clearly did not intend the dialogue and the argument therein as a reply to Christian doctrine. It was written hundreds of years before Christ was born. Rather, I think it's better to interpret Plato as trying to comment upon notions of religious piety generally, and if we want to think about it in a larger context, to comment upon the viability of authority figures as the sole source of moral authority. Thus, Plato's criticism of divine command theory, while it certainly applies to contemporary interpretations of divine command theory within the Judeo-Christian tradition, seeks to establish the independence and objective nature of morality, and not to attack specific religious beliefs or practices. Plato's argument seeks to establish that commitment to divine command theory results in a dilemma. Now, in philosophy and in logic, a dilemma arises when one's theoretic commitments or proposition has the implication or forces a choice between two equally undesirable or untenable options, either implications or interpretations. So, for example, whenever you find yourself in a situation where it seems like your view forces you to make a choice between two implications or interpretations where neither one seems desirable or satisfying, that is a dilemma. We encounter dilemmas in our everyday life on a pretty regular basis. So if you're a vegan and you're asked to choose between two different meals, a pork sandwich or a steak, that choice is a dilemma, given that neither of your meal options is consistent with your dietary preferences. Or if you find that one friend is lying to another friend, then you have this dilemma of choosing. Should you tell the friend who's being lied to and betray the trust of the other friend? Or should you not tell that person and then betray their trust? In theoretical context, a dilemma is considered to be a real difficulty for a theory. It means that the theory doesn't look like it has a consistent, coherent, desirable set of implications and interpretations. Now, in the Euthyphro, Plato seeks to establish a dilemma by trying to understand that fundamental claim of divine command theory. So Plato asks us to consider the following two interpretations of the view. The first interpretation says, look, are moral acts willed by God because they're good? Or the second interpretation, are they morally good because they're willed by God? Now, the difference between these two sentences might not seem significant, but in fact it is. Let's consider that first sentence. If the divine command theorist holds that first view, that first interpretation, that morally good acts are willed by God because they are morally good, then the divine command theorist seems to deny divine command theory. Why is that? Well, if God wills morally good acts because of their goodness, if there are features of those actions that make them good, and that's why God wills them, in other words, their goodness causes God's choice or command, then those acts must be morally good prior to and independent of God's willing, and thus moral goodness is independent of God's will. So in other words, it's the goodness of the act that causes God's willing, not the other way around. The force of this objection, the undesirability of this choice, is often characterized as it rendering God a mere reporter as opposed to an authority. So God would look out with God's omniscience and see acts, judge them to be moral on the basis of their properties, and hence will them to be moral. Now, there's an advantage to that because God would have reasons for why God willed particular things to be moral and immoral. However, that effectively eviscerates the view, because if God is merely observing an independent feature of the world and then willing in accordance with that independent pre-existing feature, it's the goodness of the act that causes God's will and not God's will that causes the goodness of the act. And as a result, divine command theory seems to be impotent as an explanation for moral goodness or badness, praiseworthiness or blameworthiness. What about the other horn of this dilemma? Suppose the divine command theorist says, yes, that can't be right. God can't look and see properties of actions, and because of those properties, will the action to be moral or immoral. No, instead, it's got to be that God's willing that the action is moral, or willing that it's immoral, willing that it's praiseworthy, or willing that it's blameworthy, that is the reason, the cause for its moral goodness or its moral badness. That's what I really meant to say. Well, that view also faces problems. If goodness depends exclusively on God's will, there are no other reasons. There's no features of the action that God could point to justify that choice. Then goodness looks arbitrary. That is, divine command theory appears to commit one to the idea that goodness is really just holy whimsy. That is, whatever God wills is good, and there is no other reason or rationale for its goodness or badness. Now, in a classical metaphor, the view really does seem to be impaled upon this dilemma. It tries to avoid Charybdis, horn number one, only to be impaled upon Cilia. That is, the divine command theorist seems to be put in this position where either they abandon the central tenet of their view and acknowledge that goodness and badness are determined, at least in part, independent of God's will, or they must embrace that view, and as a result, they can cite no other reason for an action being good or bad, praiseworthy or blameworthy, making the choice that God makes, the commands that God issue, look capricious, arbitrary, and in some sense not really real. Now, there are other problems that theorists have noticed with divine command theory. For instance, though divine command theory makes some biblical passages seem less problematic, it also makes others seem more problematic. So what are we to make, for example, with statements such as God is good or all God's commands are good? Such statements seem to have little meaning under divine command theory other than God does as God wills, or God's commands are God's commands. Finally, divine command theory seems to clash with our notions of morality. Specifically, any action willed by God is good, no matter how seemingly abhorrent. For instance, if God decides to torture us for all eternity, not because we disobeyed God, but just for God's own amusement, that would be morally good on divine command theory. Genocide, all of the things that we talked about earlier, are good on divine command theory, even though intuitively they just don't seem like they're good. As a result, divine command theory looks very problematic. However, in the next lecture module, we'll think about responses that the divine command theorists might make to Plato's argument and to other charges.